We're having two very quick sessions this morning. So now it's Christoph Spork, 30-minute slot on result chain-oriented impact evaluation. Boy, you have to simplify that name at some point.
Yeah.
This is very complicated. So Christoph, and then after the session, we're going to have a coffee break. And so Christoph is a... I need my glasses, otherwise I cannot see my notes again. Keep on losing them. Christoph is a researcher and lecturer with a Institute of Applied Media Studies in Zurich at the University of Applied Sciences there. And Christoph's research interest is in journalistic practices and quality in Africa mostly, but he's also a consultant on evaluating media assistance projects. Now, and this methodology he's presenting today is shedding light on how information is actually processed in different steps by audiences. And I mean, we invited this to our conference because we think that trust is embedded in those different phases of information processing, such as selecting information, assessing it, reflecting it, discussing it, or in all these steps of information processing, trust plays a role. So we take a bit of a broader view on trust instead of just simply using this concept as a black box. So the floor is yours, Christoph.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to present something which we call the result chain-oriented evaluation. It is new, in brackets, rediscovered concept. And I'm exactly picking up on what you said in the first place yesterday morning. You said, we as the media assistance sector, we are looking very much at journalistic production and are concerned how that is running and producing content. And we hardly reflect on how audiences process this information. What do they do with it at the end? And this is quite surprising that we don't do that, because in our project proposals, we speak a lot what audiences should learn, what they should get informed about it, that they create awareness and finally change some practices whatsoever. So the final goal is the audience, but we are hardly concerned with that. We rediscovered the result chain-oriented evaluation when we did a study on theories of change, and we discovered that there is a huge difference between the theories of change our sector is currently using, this term theories of change, and the original model. So to have something basic, I want to explain you the main difference between what is result chains and what is the usual log frames or theories of change nowadays. So the original model was developed by Carol H. Weiss in the mid-90s. And it said, based on experience in evaluation, at least complex interventions, and media interventions are complex, need to clarify their assumptions and to open the black boxes, to make them transparent, what is really there. And they need to describe in detail the single steps within that result chain. So it works like, imagine you have cogwheels under a conveyor belt, so it needs to be very close, that every step follows the other one, and that there is a mechanism, and you should be aware about the mechanism that works there. Why do people pick something up, or what is their motivation to achieve impact? And that is then a result chain. In contrast, the current understanding of theories of change is very similar to what we have in our proposals in log frames. We have a text or we have a chart, but basically it tells the same information as the log frame does, at least on the same level of abstraction. You know, there's some variation in the text. Some phrase it as an impact hypothesis, but there is no information why this happens and why this should work. So, and I think based on the experience, the media sector at the moment suffers more from a lack of understanding how our interventions work and not how much we contribute to something. So let's get this a little bit more in detail. You may know we have these, what I call the black boxes in Logframe. You have a project like this. It starts with journalism capacity building. Then that leads to better informed citizens. We don't know really how, but we hope. And then this even leads to democratic participation. And we also don't know how exactly that works. But hope never dies. And this goes with other projects you can have. It's the same principle, like the population gets access to relevant information, then the population becomes a change agent. That reads very nicely in project proposals, and it's good for an elevator pitch with a donor, but it doesn't add to our understanding of what works and what doesn't work. So I go a little bit into the details to see the difference between the log frame and what we commonly do. So in the log frame, we have an activity. Let's have journalists are trained in independent journalism by an NGO. That gets an output. Journalists acquire knowledge and journalists acquire capacity in applying the concept. That's quite normal. And then this leads to an outcome. The quality of reporting increases. Journalists practice this new style of reporting, and that finally leads to democratization. Now, in the last 20 years, we have learned, at least in an Anglo-Saxon environment, that editors are very important. So we know we have to convince the editors as well. So editors need to establish this new type of a new concept of journalism. So, but that's still the log frame. Now, what does result chains do? Result chain ask simple questions. Why? Why should this happen? Why should journalists acquire knowledge? Why should they apply a new style? Why should editors, which is a completely different kind of people, establish the routine? Why then at the end should the quality of reporting increase? So, and we ask this because in the result chain development, we then look for other, what we call mechanisms or motivations for these processes to happen. One very famous is the rational choice. So you rationally decide, I want to enlarge my knowledge, but you could also say, I identify with a role model that I've seen applying this type of journalism. Or you can say, I have empathy with this new attitude. I sympathize with this new role of journalism in society to enlighten the people and all these kind of things. Now with editors, these are the green boxes. They may say, we need the appreciation because we get a higher audience with the new style. And we get more adverts with the new style. Or we get a tool enhanced that limits press freedom, or we get more freedom in our reporting when we apply the new style. And finally, we look for appreciation. That means journalists and reporters get feedback from the audience. So these are potential mechanisms that come to our mind that could work here. So this should convince a project, once they're aware of these mechanisms, to add new elements into that training. So in the training, you don't even not only train on the ABC of journalism, but you may talk about role models, you may talk about attitudes towards journalism, you may talk about the role in society, you may talk about options in advertising. Yeah, we talked a lot about yesterday, how this is related to good journalism. We can talk about freedom of expression aspects and maybe also about methods of feedback. How to give feedback as an editor to a journalist, how you get feedback from the audience. Okay, so if we have all this in mind, then a result chain would look like this in an ideal case, in an artificial case. This project doesn't exist, but just to show you the principle. So we start with the training of journalists in independent journalism. Then we say journalists acquire knowledge as they want to enlarge their portfolio. They are motivated to practice as they identify with the role models. Hypothetically, this is our assumption. Journalists practice as they feel part of a group sharing the new attitude. Yeah, and editors are encouraged to support the new style because they feel we get a higher audience and we get more adverts. And then it continues, editors are encouraged because they expect the appreciation of the public, of the readers, and they may support it because it prevents further limitation of media freedom. And finally, they establish this as a routine, and media content quality improves as editors, equally with reporters, get positive feedback. So you see, it combines the mechanism with the steps that follow one after the other. So this is the difference between a log frame and a result chain. So you're adding details and you're adding the mechanisms. Now we're talking about evaluation. What is the difference between that result chain evaluation and the usual evaluation that we should do, the famous randomized control group, just to be sure what the new concept can do and what it can't do? So the concept is just two steps. You develop in your projects a hypothetical result chain, as I formulated before, with the mechanisms, etc. And then the next thing is assessing whether these result chains actually work with your target groups. The technical word for this is process tracing. So you follow with your readers, for example, in this case, or with editors, has that worked or not? And you try to follow the line, to follow the result chain as exactly as you could do. In literature, you find this terrible word of theory-based impact evaluation. Normally with theory, the room empties. So we call it result chain-oriented evaluation, so you know why this happens. So what is the difference between the randomized control trial and the result chain evaluation? With randomized control trials, we do comparing treatment versus control group. In the result chain, we only look at the treatment group. In RCTs, we do before and after the media exposure. And in result chain, we only do after. The advantage of the RCT is it shows, and this is what donors like, it shows how much your intervention contributed to achieving a goal. You could say 23% of the listeners achieved that one compared to 0% with the non-listeners. The result chain only shows you how your intervention worked and how it achieved results. It doesn't compare. It shows mainly where it stopped working, where the chain broke, your hypothetical chain. It may then help editorial staff and program staff to improve for the next activities. In the project in Niger, the chief editor was saying the process helped us to reflect on what we are doing, to concentrate on the audience, to make sure we are oriented to them. The disadvantage of RCTs is it does not do the opposite. It does not show us when we know how much we contributed, we do not know how we worked. It's still an assumption, it's still a black box. And the disadvantage of the result chain, we don't know how much our intervention contributed. So we have to accept this as a major disadvantage. And it's a case study only. It does not allow to make these conclusions for similar programs or for other contexts. So what worked in Niger might not work in Mali. So we are really on a case study approach. So now, from concept to practice, is this potentially useful? I would say yes, out of the same reason, because we get knowledge what eventually works in media development and how. And it's not useful because we cannot find out how much our intervention contributes. So clearly we saw with a lot of other, I presented this to other implementers like BBC, Fondation Hirondelle, Deutsche Welle, and we agreed we need to test this concept. And I'm very happy that I had a chance to test this with some first experience with the Farmer magazine in Tanzania, with the Children TV in the MENA region, and finally with Studio Kalango with Fondation Hirondelle, who volunteered and gave money to test this approach in the field. And I want to talk a little bit about that, how that worked. So Studio Kalango, in short, is a production studio for news and debate programs. broadcast in the country over a large network of local radio stations in 5 languages and implemented by Arundel. And we picked up 2 programs that had an in-depth coverage. One was on schooling, and the other one was in the gender program on elections. And the decision was made, we look at whether it was achieved that the women were encouraged to vote independently from their husbands. So that women vote in Niger is not an issue, they all vote, but how is the decision done and to vote independently? So we come to that first example and the only one. So we started with that famous workshop with developing the hypothetical result chain. Presented to you 3 layers. The green boxes are the content of the radio. This is our true result chain, the reactions from the listeners. This is for us the mechanism behind it. Okay, so we start with information about elections. We hope that listeners see the general relevance of elections, and this is a rational choice thing. Then they get information about their rights in voting and the importance for voting for women. And it's hypothesized that listeners develop interest into election and into voting. That is something to do with empathy. Then we get information to vote based on your own considerations, especially for women, not on your husband's considerations. So listeners know their right, and especially the right to vote independently. And that is exactly rational choice. So, and then it was hypothesized if we offer a dialogue program on voting with experts and citizens, and then listeners similarly talk to peers and to husbands about the independent voting. And finally, they achieve the goal that they vote independently. We only did this study with women. So, and you see what we call the scope conditions is that it's taken for granted that listeners use that program often, regularly. This is for granted. I know it's not for granted in practice, but it's assumed here. So, and then we went to the second step, the process tracing. How did that work? So we interviewed 31 women. 4 never listened to the program, so they were excluded from that because it's a precondition that you listen to that program. So we had 27 listeners doing that. So we hypothesized they need to see the relevance first. 26 did that. We lost 1 listener who said it's not relevant for me. Then the interest in election and voting was developed quite successfully with 24 listeners. Only 3 said, no, we are out. And in the next step on the knowledge, 22 listeners said, okay, we are fine. But 5 listeners said, no, I don't perceive me as knowledgeable about these various rights. And then we come to the final goal. So we had only from those who fulfilled the entire result chain up to then. So 7 listeners did not vote independently. We call them the deviant cases. Deviance is maybe a too strong word, but it's a technical term. And we have 15 listeners were the typical cases, they went for independent voting. So another way to show this example is this one, these 4 fields. These boxes, all steps of the hypothetical result chain were fulfilled. And within that, 2 boxes, 1 box there. So we had 15 typical cases. Don't worry about the numbers, that are the numbers of the interviewees. And we had 7 deviant cases, which is quite good, and at least it poses some questions. Why so many deviant cases? And we have 3 what we call other ways to roam. So 0 means they didn't follow that line of relevance, interest, knowledge, but still they voted independently. It only shows us that our social environment is much more diverse than we hypothesize, so we reduced complexity. These are not in 2 cases. They didn't vote independently and they didn't follow the line of thinking. Okay, and that raises questions in the discussions with Irondel and with the local staff in Niger. why so many, it says, okay, we have to think about that. Why so many deviant cases? It's not so many, it's quite successful, 15 cases, but there's something we need to know more. That was the trigger to, in the fieldwork, we had also asked other questions. So then we looked at something new. So we had asked the women, on what did you base your decision to vote? And we had radio, the peers, or discussion with husbands. And then we saw, I don't analyze this statistically, but we had seen that from the deviant cases, all of them had talked to their husbands. That was the bad thing, Sophie. You see that clearly. I cannot say this, but Sophie says it. And in the typical cases, the decision was based on radio or on peers or somewhere not sure. So we see here the type of a correlation that makes us thinking what is really the cause of this or what additional elements are there. And in the discussion, we had other additional elements because in the original result chain, we said we are not talking about obstacles. So we see that we get it only half done. There are still weaknesses we don't understand because we see the role of challenges to independent voting were not discussed openly in the program and were not considered in the hypothetical result chain, but there might be, I don't know, I don't know Nietzsche very well. So there might be social cultural obstacles or religious beliefs against independent voting or traditional hindrances. We had not inquired what was the content of discussion with peers or with husbands. And we are not sure about the role of already achieved independence of women. Because we found out some strange thing that rural women were more voting independently. And my original thinking was, okay, the tradition is stronger in rural areas, but maybe that's wrong. So there is room for inquiring more after this exercise. And finally, we were not sure because we did not do analysis of the programs. The women we interviewed rarely mentioned the independent voting as their rights. They mentioned many other rights they have as voters and knowledge. So we dare to ask, did the programs really focus actually on independent voting and not just on voting and for whom you're voting, presidential, municipal, and whatnot? So to come to an end, just one type of observations in all the projects we have done now with this type, very few, we see that hardly anybody works with these detailed result chains. Not even in the internal planning, which surprises me, because that's the essence of most of your projects and programs. You want to influence somehow the audience, even if you do independent journalism. You want to advance knowledge or consciousness or practice or whatever, or participation. So it's hardly done. If it is done, we see that the obvious hindrances or tensions are not considered, like economic challenges, as I said, social, cultural, religious issues, prejudices against other belongings, other beliefs. We identified that rational choice is mostly often the sole mechanism people think about. But we all know that we are not always rational people. So I would suggest we have a necessity to think about other mechanisms. Let's say identification with role models. Yeah, many people like to do interviews like Stephen Sackel from the BBC. Empathy. If you see someone who has suffered from something, then you may develop empathy, or social recognition and positive affirmation. Yeah, so if you want to apply a new concept, you need to get recognized and to need positive affirmation from your peer group or from your colleagues or from the public. Our first insights, and they are very tentative, is we think that with these result chains, if you consider them, the projects should start with them at the project phase, at the project planning phase, at the very beginning. Please don't just copy what your program from Libya to Iraq. Yeah, do these kind of exercises for different contexts. And the main question is, why should your target groups do what you expect them to do? I'm not thinking it's not possible. I'm just saying we need to think about it. And formulate realistic hypothetical result chains. Formulation helps to be honest, I think. Once you have formulated something, it may sound too ambitious. And build these new elements into your program. Evaluate, do the evaluation only after 1 or 2 years, but when target groups have a realistic chance to have changed something and start the next learning loop. And I think it's applicable to many of our normal projects in the media assistance sector. Thank you very much so far.
Immediate questions from the audience? 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Because we are a bit in it under time pressure. I take this question.
Miriam Köhler, Deutsche Welle Akademie. I was quite interested in mechanisms. How do you decide which mechanisms are relevant to the project or your activity or not? Is this based on a set of pre-established mechanisms or criteria? Do you derive at them while talking through, or how does that work?
May I answer directly? It depends completely on the project stuff or on the editorial stuff. We have some ideas, but at the moment we have not enough experience to say, oh, these 3 are established. These are still ideas, and the project itself and the program staff and the editorial staff should say, this may work in Niger, but in Niger we have to talk about, when it comes to schooling, about that young girls don't go to school because they need to fetch water. They don't go to school. So this is not applicable in other countries, things like that. So it depends completely on what you as a project decide. And I think the beauty is to discover new mechanisms.
Thank you, Christoph. Ines Drees from Erich Prost Institute. I heard about the result chain already from you, and I always find it really interesting and I think a very useful tool for, project planning and really being explicit about what one is planning to do there, now in this presentation, I was wondering, because you mentioned that that you spoke or interviewed 27 women on, they reported on how they voted. Did you do that via interviews, or was it a survey as well? These women, when they reported back to you, on what grounds they took their voting decision, how did you study that?
So it's important to understand that this was not a representative sample. So the listeners were identified by the radio station in various places in Niger. So they were the heavy listeners, if you like. And we had an interview guide administered by local students who spoke the local language. And we had questions on what grounds they based their voting decisions. Yeah, in the questionnaire, in the interview guide.
So it was like an open or a semi-structured interview.
It was a semi-structured one.
Okay. Yeah, because I thought it was a little bit difficult to answer that question, on what do you ground your voting decision on. I mean, if you would ask me, there could be thousands of factors, and I'm not sure if one is psychologically able to know these things.
Yes, hopefully, and I think we still have to improve on that. to ask smart questions that are that really discover the issue we want to discover, especially when it comes to mechanisms. But I think it was in the real interview guide, it was laid down in 3 questions. So we had a control question on that and these kind of mechanisms. So we were sure about it. But yeah, it's a self-perception thing that has usually the downside that people might not remember what they really did. Okay, you try to counter that with follow-up questions or with other questions in other parts of the interview to rectify, but yeah, it's a good point.
Okay, if I may, I'm not asking my questions, but I want to bring in the questions from the online guests. I had the impression we are neglecting them a bit. So
is it loud enough? I can't hear it.
Can the others hear me? Is that fine? Is it better, Christoph, for you? Okay, one is from Jan Lublinski, our colleague also from Deutsche Welle Academy. And he says, can you imagine testing interventions with the aim at building audience's trust in a given media outlet with a result chain approach? So use the approach for the question of building trust.
Add to this? Also, I was wondering if you cannot exploit the methodology more than you do. You hear me? More than you do to understand like in-depth processes of, you know, information reflection. And I find it, you have this tendency to use it very quantitatively with all the numbers, whereas with the methodology itself, you have a tool at hand that allows you to explore much deeper than you do, in my impression, to really understand how, you know, trust and processing is working. I mean, could be even more exploited in this direction, I think. And then regarding that question from Jan, to also understand how trust plays a role in those different steps, maybe.
Yes, thank for the encouragement to use that even more. I would not agree that we use that quantitatively. I only presented the number to see for some listeners, the result chain breaks down, and for some they work. And for the majority, we think we have not discovered the whole result chain. In the interviews itself, we discovered a lot of other things. Otherwise, I would not have on what grounds do you base your decision to vote was not part of the result chain. It was something we ask additionally just to get more information on what works and what not. We did even ask on how do you rate the trust? I mean, inspired by the upcoming FOME Symposium, we also inquired about trust, sure, on a 0 to 10 Likert scale, but we didn't see any combination so far. And I think trust building is a long-term exercise. And but if somebody comes up and says, with this project, we want to develop trust, and we have to ask, why should people now trust? Because they see how the finances work, they see that the editorial standards are recognized, they can look at, maybe then you could do it, but it needs to be a special project. It's not like a squeeze in, as I think it's a long-term thing as well.
Thank you, Anya. Sacha Mutter, Head of Research and Policy at Fondation Hirondelle. So first, I wanted to highlight how much we thought we had to learn thanks to this type of exercise. So I would like to thank Christoph a lot again for this, for implementing this exercise with us. Of course, we see a lot of room for improvement along the line highlighted by Ines and Anya in better understanding the why of the deviant cases. One thing we thought afterward too was how much useful it would be to complement the exercise with a content analysis of the production to see, for example, whether the radio programs talked about the social and economical hindrances or the right to vote independently or not, and therefore whether it was, whether it calls for an adaptation of our editorial content or whether it's just things that are beyond the scope of our influence. So that's one thing. And the other one that I wanted to highlight is at the basis, at the origin of this exercise, there was an aim to have a collaboration within the sector with different actors, testing different aspects of our common theories of change. Unfortunately, so far we have been the only one engaging in this exercise with Christoph. So we hope there will be other actors engaging in this exercise together with him on complementary aspects of our common theories of change. And we also need to be to join force in sharing the results to our donors and policymakers. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There's a question from Friederike van Franke. I think you all know her. She was a moderator in yesterday's sessions. And it's about, could you use your methodology also to compare the impact or in how far different kind of media are most impactful, like radio versus social media or newspapers?
In principle, yes. If you have a project that runs with radio emissions and at the end you compare this, but then it needs to be very similar in the goals. So you could say, okay, newspapers work better than radio if it's the same project. But the comparative aspect, I want to be clear, is not the core issue of this. It's how understanding how projects work, different ones, but the comparison is not inbuilt. We are strictly focusing on one thing. That's the downside of it. But I think we have to learn so much, so it's a good thing to start with it.
Thank you so much, Christoph, for this insight in this methodology. We move on. Birgitte, you wanted to announce something as well for the upcoming panel, or? Okay, sorry. Yeah, so we have now, we're a little bit late and we start at 11 o'clock with the next panel. Enjoy your coffee break now.